Hello, good evening everybody. I'm really pleased to be able to join you via video. Sorry that I'm not there in person. Actually, as you're watching this, I'm going to be in Oldham, where I'm working at Oldham College, supporting them with a programme which we're calling Teaching for Distinction, which is very exciting. I'm really grateful to Will and John for inviting me to take part in the event though, and I hope what I present to you in the next few minutes will be interesting. I'm going to base what I'm going to say this evening around my book that I've just written. I'm very excited about this, The Learning Rainforest. And really, I'm just going to use that as a structure for putting forward the ideas that I've put in the book, which I do think are relevant to the theme of bridging the gap or closing the gap for disadvantaged learners. When I was writing the book, I was thinking about how to present all the ideas I've got about teaching and learning. And what I started to do was think about some of the debates that I've engaged in through Twitter and through reading blogs and through reading all the books that I've read. And there are so many of them, but I've done my best to give a sense of the debates. So there's a big section around this difference between progressive education and traditional education, and telling a story a bit about my journey, where I think really over the last few years I've definitely become more traditional in my thinking, and partly that's been influenced by research. There's a section where I've tried to distill through what I've read from research, from reading books, and I actually think there's a lot of weight there which suggests that really focusing on knowledge and instructional methods that secure knowledge are really important. But there's more to it than that, so I've tried to look at what we are trying to teach rather than just how, and I think that's really important that we talk about the curriculum. Now, curriculum has lots of different forms. You might think of curriculum meaning the subjects that you have on your timetable, and that is obviously a part of it. But for me, the curriculum really comes down to the content of each of those boxes on the timetable, and even within that, the scope that teachers have to enact the curriculum, to deliver the curriculum in a certain way. It has a huge bearing on the actual experience that young people have in the classroom. So two teachers in next door classrooms could easily have the same identical scheme of work, but the enacted curriculum and therefore the curriculum that students experience could be very different. And I think schools need to think carefully about what type of school they want to be, what curriculum experiences they want all students to have. And that's where this relates to what you're talking about this evening. It's all students. There are lots of advantages that privileged middle class children have through their home learning environment. Their cultural capital will be richer, their access to aspirations and learning of different kinds beyond the classroom will be typically richer. And I think that's the challenge that we have. The curriculum that we set in our classrooms, in the whole school, not just in the subjects that we teach and the content of them, but also the opportunities beyond the classroom, the whole thing. If we're educating the whole child, the curriculum is complicated. So I've explored that in some detail. And the final thing I wanted to look at was assessment, because we tend to get dominated by assessment in our system because of accountability pressure. And I think we need to try to reclaim assessment as an authentic process which simply tells us what excellence looks like, whether we've reached it. And there are lots of fantastic people like Daisy Christodoulou and Dylan William who can guide us in that area. And really, I think all teachers and leaders should be really looking very hard at their assessment practice and saying, are we really delivering assessment which improves learning, or is it just feeding the data machine? It's one of my favourite challenges to school leaders or teachers, which is that if you deleted the entire school database, wiped it clean, how long would it take before a student noticed? So let me tell you about the Learning Rainforest metaphor. Basically, the rainforest as a whole represents the fact that your classroom is made up of individuals where each one needs to be treated and regarded as an individual. But they obviously interrelate and they have relationships between each other. And excellence can take lots of different forms, just like when you walk through a rainforest, you're going to see lots of different species and lots of different individual specimens, which are all valuable in their own right. But another aspect is that none of that is a mystery, not a total mystery. Science tells us quite a lot about how plants grow, even though we don't know exactly what's going to happen to each one. And that's what I think is true about learning. It's a mistake to think that learning is so unknowable and teaching is so complicated we can never really understand it, because I think we can. And I think research is showing us that there are some things that are true and that we need to understand. So I'm trying to balance this sort of art and science, the research with the complexity of our daily experience in the metaphor. Central to this rainforest metaphor is each of the individual trees. So here I've talked about establishing the conditions. So every tree needs to have a good environment in which to grow. Then there's building the knowledge structure, which is about creating a secure knowledge base on which all the other things hang. And finally, it's about exploring the possibilities. Once you've got a strong knowledge structure, there's all kinds of things you can do with learning. And all those things link together. So it's not like you do one and then the other and the other. They can grow simultaneously, just like all parts of the tree grow together. But a key thing that I stress all the time is that you can't get the lush canopy of the rainforest without the solid trunks. You can't go off and do weird and wonderful, exotic things with students if their knowledge is insecure. So I talk a lot about really focusing on building knowledge and doing that systematically and very deliberately in order that you can start doing things like extensive projects and independent learning and debates. All those things are really valuable, but they require knowledge, and you can't shortcut that. You can't get past that, and sometimes that's the hard bit. So that's what I've broken it down into, and in the book what I've done is I've tried to put ideas around each of these things. So I'll just show you briefly what it looks like. For establishing the conditions, we've got a section on attitudes, habits for excellence, and part of that is joy, awe and wonder. I really think it's important. It's not icing on the cake to be a teacher that says this stuff is fantastically exciting and to inspire some awe in your students. I think that's essential. That's part of being a teacher. That's what makes teaching great, to do it. But also it goes hand in hand with rigour. And the best teachers I see are ones who insist on very particular standards from students at all ages. I say, no, that's not good enough. You need to do better than that. You can do better than that. And they demand excellence and they demand high performance all the time, not just before the exams, but all the way through. And there's a theme around pitching it up, teaching to the top, making sure that the most sophisticated learners, the highest attaining students in your class are always challenged all the time, and you really get driven by them all the way through. Another section is around relationships and behaviour. So that's obviously important. You can't teach well in an environment which isn't nurturing, caring, and where there isn't good discipline. And possibly one of the more controversial or challenging parts of what I've written in the book is my view about behaviour. And I do think that we need to have much more strict behaviour systems in schools, and there needs to be an idea of compliance, which I explore in some detail. There's a difference to me between compliant children and students who comply with reasonable rules. We don't want to have children all suppressed in their rows, afraid to speak. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about real discipline, so you can have really focused learning, and I think that's an important balance to strike. And finally, in this section, there is a thing about planning the curriculum, because I think this is something you have to get right before you go off into the classroom and enact it. You need to think about what it is you're doing. And there are various ideas here around specifying knowledge and using knowledge organisers, that sort of thing, making sure that lessons are planned around really specific learning objectives, and getting the balance right between scaffolding learning so that students can access it, but not being so dependent that they can never be independent on their own, work on their own. So this idea of stabilisers, they have to come off and you have to withdraw support at the right time. The next section is called Building the Knowledge Structure. And I think there's some really good routines around this which teachers can develop quite well. We can talk about, and actually it's where most CPD ought to be around, I think, is around how we explain the concepts that we want to teach. Lots of modelling, and really I don't see enough of that. I don't see enough teachers really modelling excellence and this whole idea of metacognition and how you know what you know needs to be developed. Lots around questioning techniques I've explored. Teachers who are highly effective, as lots of research studies show, ask lots of questions, and they're questions which are probing, and you get away from kind of the default hands up culture, which I still find dominates in a lot of classrooms. And finally, we're looking at lots of things to do with feedback. Gosh, teachers are battered with excessive marking policies that don't lead to good outcomes. And we need to look at effective, lean marking and feedback systems which are pushing students forward. And then there's a whole section around explicitly teaching for memory. It's a part of the big awakening, I think, that comes from cognitive psychology, is around learning, meaning, knowing things or being able to do things in the long term, not just in the here and now. The difference between learning and performance is absolutely essential to understand. Which means that as you're teaching, you've got to be always thinking, okay, I'm getting some feedback from them now that they seem to understand it and know it now, but I need to make sure they can do this tomorrow and again next month. And that is a different type of teaching. So teaching for memory, teaching so that students can do things in an embedded way is really important. And that means doing lots of recall testing, retrieval practice, and lots of practice in all the skills that you're getting students to deliver. Finally, when you do have the knowledge structure secured, what can we do with it? And there's so many things you can do. And I have, in the book, explored this idea of what I call a mode A, mode B split. A mode A is when you are explicitly building knowledge, where you are focusing on instruction, typically teaching from the front, asking probing questions, giving lots of verbal feedback, getting students to practice, but it's very much driven by you. And mode B teaching, which is when you're sort of saying, okay, over to you, what can you do with it? And you're doing things like group work, hands-on learning, discovery. Now, those things have their place in the curriculum. My sense is that, say, as a science teacher, it's about an 80-20 split. And most of the time, I'm going to be driving the learning and being very instructional. And about 20% of the time, I'm going to be getting students to be leading. Other teachers have said that's too far in one direction or the other, and that's a debate for you to have for yourself. Depends on what subject you teach. But it's not like it's all of one or all of the other, and sometimes that's where our debate gets sucked into a vortex of confrontation that's totally unnecessary. It's about how much of each of those types of learning are important and when they should be done in the right sequence. So let's have a look at what I mean by the possibilities. I think it's fantastic to do things like play detective. I've seen some amazing lessons in science and in languages where students are given something to discover, to find out. Maths investigations. I mean, you've got to do a maths investigation at least some point in your maths education. And when you find something, and it's incredibly rewarding when you do that, you discover a rule. That wouldn't be how you want to learn everything, because it's too inefficient, and it's much more efficient to directly teach most knowledge. But at some point in your education, you need to be given a chance to find out what it feels like to explore and discover. What about projects, for example? I've seen some incredible projects where students were asked by the teacher to dazzle them with their product. And they did. It was just fantastic. Really extended piece of work, very original, where without the structure to kind of narrow their work into something that was just like one the teacher had made, it was very original. And I've seen that in lots of contexts, but I've also seen projects which are very, very thin in terms of the substance, and which made you think, was this a really good use of their time? Similarly with group work, I think in the context of a whole child developing and a whole education, at some point they need to work collaboratively and learn to do that well. But that needs guidance, it needs guidelines, it needs to be structured well so that you get a good product and everybody is learning. Again, a lot of group work is often very lightweight and probably not a good use of students' time. So it's not a question of should you do projects and group work or not. It's about how can we do these things well, with rigor, with substance, with a good knowledge structure, and how can we get them in the right balance so that they flow from a good knowledge base. And I explore lots of examples of that in the book, and typically you find these things are better later on in the school rather than earlier, because that's where the students have already gained the knowledge. Finally, I look at what I call further possibilities. There are so many exciting things to do. One of my favourite things that I've ever done as a teacher was a process of co-construction, where I worked with students side by side, my sidekicks, and we had online modules from Edmodo and Google to support the learning, where we could communicate between lessons, and they would teach some of the lessons. They would do class demos in science. They would even mark books and set tests. It was fantastic. I mean, they were really involved in their own learning process, but they could do it because we made sure that the knowledge was there, and it wouldn't work if they didn't. But they were learning ahead of their peers, and this thing of peer teaching is a really powerful technique for actually securing understanding. So that's what makes up the trees in the Learning Rainforest. Each one of them that needs to have teachers establishing the conditions, then building the knowledge structure, and finally exploring the possibilities. And if you do all those things in the right way, in the right sequence, I think teaching is rewarding, enjoyable, but it's also highly effective. And that's what we're trying to do for all learners, which comes back to the theme of this evening. So look, thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that's been useful. I hope some of you go and read the book and then tell me what you think, because it's just my ideas, and I'm always interested to hear new ones and to have challenges and people say it doesn't make sense or doesn't apply in their context. So let me know if that's what you think. But if you do like it, let me know that too. Okay, well, have a good evening. Thank you for having me.